All right. Hello, my name is Marisa Christian. I'm a senior content marketing manager at Coalition. Very excited to be joined today by Catherine Lyle, our head of claims, and Chris Hendricks, head of Coalition Incident Response. In today's webinar, we're going to share insights from our H1 2021 cyber insurance claims report, which features real Coalition data from policyholder claims to highlight the biggest cyber threats organizations are facing today. A quick note about Zoom before we kick off. You should see the two buttons at the bottom of your screen where you can submit questions. You have the chat button and the Q&A button. I'm sure we're all very familiar with these buttons at this point in time, but please feel free to submit your questions throughout, and we will have a dedicated time reserved at the end for Q&A. All right, our agenda. So we will go over the main claims trends that we have featured in the report. And then we will go into how cyber criminals are monetizing their crimes through ransomware and funds transfer fraud, how they are executing these crimes with business email compromise, taking advantage of insecure remote access and supply chain attacks, followed by cyber predictions from our in-house experts and any open questions that you may have. So now I'm going to pass it off to Catherine to talk about our main claims trends.
Thank you so much and welcome everybody. I really appreciate you taking the time to actually dig in a little bit deeper with us on the claims trends, what we're seeing. The more that we're aware, the more that we make you aware, the more we can make our mutual customers and clients aware. So we're going to kick off first to really talk about, on the next slide, the claims data info and where this is coming from for you. So this claims data that we're going to be talking about today, it comes from three main sources: our policyholders, the market data, which is NAIC, but then also what we've done is through insurance applications that we've received, we've also culled information. So it gives us more information to share with you. What you will notice throughout the entire presentation is that there are differences in our numbers and what we're seeing in the market. That goes back to both our underwriting and risk engineering capabilities. These are very unique amongst Coalition, and that is what reflects those differences. This report itself that you will ultimately, and you have access to, right, it doesn't include claims that are still maturing. And as we can all appreciate, these claims don't just appear and get closed immediately. And through the course of this, you'll see why. But let's just kick off with those understanding of where we start to talk about some of those key cyber claim trends. What we're seeing on the next slide, we can talk about how cyber crime itself is increasing like never before. This will come to no surprise to anybody that reads the newspaper, anybody who watches the news. This is increasing across the board. Business email compromises, which we call BECs, they lead the way in frequency. They have an incident report of increase of 51% over the first half of last year. BEC incidents continue to be the most widespread. Email is usually that first entrance point for business email compromises, funds transfer fraud, and ransomware. Because of that, we also see that ransomware is growing, but it's also growing in severity. The average ransomware demand made to our policyholders in the first half of 2021 was $1.2 million. That's a large price to pay for any organization, and is nearly 170% increase from the average demand of the first half of 2020. Why this is happening in part is the dislocation that we have had happen because of COVID, and we'll talk about COVID a little bit more. And so they're really taking advantage of that situation. We've seen this across the board with ransomware, with funds transfer, et cetera. And again, we will dig into that a little bit more. What we've also noticed is that historically, and many of you who've been in this business long enough have seen, Historically, smaller companies weren't targets because they didn't have enough data. But the way things have changed is that criminals have found a way to immediately monetize a crime. So they don't care if it's a small company or a large company. It's actually just if the windows and doors are open, if the accessibility is there, they will target them for funds transfer fraud, which will immediately monetize their crime, as well as ransomware. And so we've seen frequency of incidents reported for organizations under 250 employees increased by 57% from the first half of 2020 to the first half of 2021. And this is why cyber insurance works, right? This is why when we've seen these more increase in claims, we've seen the increase in industry, size of entity, and type of crime. This is where cyber insurance works for that risk transfer. So let's dig a little bit deeper and talk about cyber claim frequency. Policyholders, if you're talking again, this is one of the situations where I say coalition is a little bit different. The market for 2020 was 5.9%. The frequency for coalition policyholders was 1.6%. Now we've seen an uptick of this to 2.4%. But as you can see from even the standard of 2019, 2020, and all the way back to 2018, the market standard is going to be much higher. And so coalition insureds are experiencing less frequency than the market. We can look also though at frequency and severity. So what I'm doing for you here is kind of dicing up this information and looking at it in different views with you. So in our last report, we stated that frequency of attacks increased, and so did the severity of these events. But since that report, we actually saw the frequency of ransomware has dipped slightly. In the second half of 2020, there's been a resurgence in 2021. BEC has also made a steady climb over this last year. As I talked about before, it's up 51%. And FTF, which is that funds transfer fraud, has increased 28% compared to previous years. Drilling even deeper. So now let's talk about it even more, just about one type of loss. Let's talk about ransomware itself. Ransomware has increased from the first half of 2020 to 2021 from $440,000 on average as the demand. I want to be very clear, this is the demand. It's nearly tripled to a demand of 1.1 million. Now, the reason I'm very clear that this is the demand, this is not the amount that ultimately was paid out, right? We were, through our work of negotiations, backups, all of those types of things, we're able to drive these down, but this was the initial demand. And the reason this is happening is because of that dislocation that I talked about before. Criminals are taking advantage of how we work now, right? I'm sitting here in Colorado. Chris is on the East Coast. Marisa's over in California. Here we are, a disbanded group. This is no different than any other business that exists right now. This change was the cause for that increase in 2020 because the fact that many organizations were forced to transition to this remote work environment. They often settled into an ease and lack of reliability in their systems. So what this did is this allowed this rush. It allowed criminals to take advantage of the holes that were created in security, and criminals seized upon that. And so we see that increase, the percentage of increase in applicants with insecure remote access enabled. Similarly, when I talked about it before, about how small companies are being increasingly targeted, this is something that a lot of brokers have, they raise many times over the years of saying, hey, smaller companies just aren't targets. Well, as you can see here, small and mid-sized businesses are impacted far more in cybercrime right now. The frequency is up 57%. And this is just for companies with less than 250 employees. While historically they weren't targeted, they are now. And this relates again back to the fact of the way that criminals have changed their crime. Threat actors have moved to a point of saying, hey, look, as long as we can monetize it, I don't have to sell your data. So I don't have to make sure I get a large data set. If I can steal your money outright or encrypt all of your data and demand you pay me, I've monetized the crime immediately versus having to take your data, split it apart, sell your data, and hope someone will buy that data. And as you see these increases, they're devastating to any size. As you can imagine, a smaller company being asked to pay $1 million, 1.2 million, and they're small, they don't have that money sitting around. Another benefit of that coalition policy is we pay on behalf of our insureds. So we pay ransomware for them. We pay that ransom demand for them. One other bit of bad news is that more industries are being targeted. And I hazard to say that it's all industries now. Before, it used to be healthcare, financial services, and hoteling and those types of services. We're seeing a large increase in real estate, professional services. And the super interesting one is nonprofit. Historically, people thought, well, you don't have the information we need. But again, criminals don't care who they're going to strike. And they will strike everything from a pipeline to a nonprofit. We have seen this. And so it only comes in handy when they're able to say during negotiations, hey, look, you've hit a nonprofit, we're not able to pay this. And that helps with negotiations. But when they've had that risk transfer to a carrier, right, to an insurance policy, it helps them get back up and running that much faster. So let's talk about monetization, right? I've talked about this quickly about what is monetization is what we really need to focus on now. The business model of cybercrime has changed. I've touched upon it, right? The way that it used to work is they would have to steal large sums of data and sell it. They have completely transitioned. And while data theft still remains and occurs, and it's a headache and a problem, it's used now more to put the feet to the fire. So for ransomware, they encrypt everyone's files. Then they take files and say, hey, look, we're going to publish these unless you pay the ransom, because someone may have a backup, et cetera. Similarly, they'll be in someone's email for longer, be able to figure out what's going on and who talks to whom about paying a bill, and then insert themselves in that conversation and have someone transfer funds to the threat actor's account. So overall, these crimes, it's really become a lucrative business. The reason I use business is it is not the traditional hacker that's sitting in a hooded sweatshirt, in mom and dad's basement. This is now although it's not incorporated, they're a company for any other terms. They come in, they report to their boss gives them assignment, they go out, they start hacking. And the way we see this, it's reflective, is that you see these demands, again, it's a demand, increasing from $440,000 to 1.1 million. And then also with funds transfer, you've seen 179% increase. So it means that people are transferring not the $116,000 anymore, but now $326,000 on average. And what this happens is it happens either through multiple slices of, hey, pay this bill, pay it again, and they don't notice, right? Our insureds don't notice that they paid out these bills 3 times to a threat actor, or the threat actor is going for the larger sums because they're in the systems longer. They're in the systems longer because they're exploiting COVID, right? We have a situation where they're in the email longer, people are clicking on the items that they shouldn't click on, and they're not double checking. We used to have a situation where we were all under one roof. And I'd say, hey, I received this bill from Joe. Hey, Joe, who's in the next cube or in the next office, did you send me this request? And Joe would say, absolutely not. Or they would say, hey, look, I just talked to our vendor the other day because I know how to get a hold of them, right? They're in that brick and mortar building. Now we're using people's cell phones. So we have that, they were disconnected. or they're just responding in an email and saying, hey, did you mean to send this to me? Are we changing your banking information? To which the threat actor responds and says, yes, thank you for asking. We're changing it, because they're in that person's email account. So let's talk about how this happens in ransomware. We all know ransomware, it's just not malware anymore, right? It's not trying to just throw things off. It's a criminal business model where they go in, they see doors and windows open, and Chris is going to talk about exploitation in just a little bit. And they send this variant in. It goes unnoticed. Even with EDR, which is endpoint monitoring, it may have been noticed, but someone may not be able to respond quick enough. They're also in the system longer. So they're able to go across and transverse someone's system and find their cloud backups and encrypt those as well. So when you have these remote systems, when you have these weakened systems, right, not as strong, that gives the threat actor that much longer to be able to say, hey, look, now we're going to demand more. And you see that each of these variants are now demanding more. It used to be that they were asking for, I mean, I hazard to, like, again, I hate saying these things, but I remember back in the day where the demands were $2,000, $7,500. And now we're getting 500,000, million, 1.2. You've certainly seen in the news, 72 million, 50 million. These are things that are not uncommon. And it changes by the variant. And the reason it changes by the variant is because each one of these threat actors takes a different tact, and they're working in different areas. So they understand that system extremely well. And then on top of their demand, there's certain variants that are also being aggressive in other manners. So Hello Kitty is on everyone's radar, because not only do they say, hey, we exfiltrated data, they go through that data and they start calling the insured's customers and saying, hey, if you want this system back online, you better tell them to pay the ransomware. We have recordings of the threat actors for Hello Kitty calling both our insureds and our negotiators and saying, you need to move forward and do this, or we will do the following. So even when the process to recover and restore business operations, let's talk about that. Even when system backups are readily available, this still can be complex, and it's made complex because of the variant. And what's unfortunate is that small and mid-sized businesses are impacted more than larger organizations because they're least able to defend themselves. They're least able to bounce back quickly because they don't have as many individuals. And according to Covor, 70% of ransomware attacks impact organizations with fewer than 1,000 employees. So you understand that those companies have less ability because they have less ability to defend, but they also have less teamwork to be able to rebuild. And that's where we come in at Coalition. For funds transfer, gosh, this is just the easiest way to monetize a crime, right? You're basically getting tricked. The threat actor is tricking someone when they're in their email system. It's not as sophisticated as ransomware. It's also preventable in a much easier mechanic. So what you do is you say, hey, look, turn on two-factor authentication for your email. So it means that if someone outside of your trusted source, right? If you're the trusted source and you're not using your computer, it will say, hey, enter your secondary code. You will get alerted. If you get that alert, you know someone's trying to get into your system. Really quite simple. But it also then prevents that person, that threat actor, from getting in the system. The secondary simple way of preventing this is whenever you see a new request or a change in payment request. So a new payment request or a change in payment request, meaning, hey, we've changed our bank account because of COVID, that should send a red flag. Companies don't freely change banking information. It is super complex, super hard to do. They have to notify everybody of what's happened, that they've changed it. So it's very rare. So you should pick up the phone and call the last known phone number for that person and ask them, hey, are you really changing your banking information? And this usually prevents it. But the way that funds transfer fraud is working is by those spoofed emails being in someone's email box, doctored invoices. But these are all things that funds transfer fraud does, because then it routes your money to now directly into the threat actor. The threat actor then transfers out that money as quickly as possible, and we have a large loss. We've seen losses we've had, as I was talking about before, nonprofits. We've seen $1.3 million transferred out at one time, and we were able to recover all of that money. So let's talk about funds transfer fraud recovery. While the frequency of funds transfer fraud cases increased greatly from H1 of 2020 to H1 of 2021, 28%. What we've also seen, though, is that we've been able to, coalition, through our efforts, have been able to recover 95% of those funds when we are told about this. And this is even an increase from 2020. We have a better rate of recovery than the FBI. This is something I'm very proud of for our team. But there's a way that we do this, right? You can help recover, and you can encourage your clients to help us recover these funds. The way we do that is you notify claims, coalition claims, immediately, soon as possible. If it's within 72 hours, we can actually get the FBI to help us as well. We immediately notify your bank, and we talk to them about clawbacks and filing fraud reports. We then reach out to the FBI, and we also file an IC3 Gov report. We work with the local police department, and then we are the squeaky wheel. We are consistently working with the receiving bank to have them freeze that account. And if we have to, getting the FBI to knock on that virtual door of that bank to say, freeze that account so that money doesn't go anywhere. And that is what has led to our assisting our insureds to that recovery. Now, I spoke a little bit about execution on how some of this is done. Chris is going to now talk about really the depths of how execution is happening for BEC through remote access, and talk about some supply chain hacks.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I do appreciate it. So welcome, everyone. My name is Chris Hendricks. I run the incident response team here at Coalition. As Catherine just mentioned, I would like to talk about attacker tactics and techniques. These are the behaviors that the attackers are doing technically or through social engineering to accomplish the monetization that Catherine just discussed. And as you can see here in the first half report from 2020, we see it split almost evenly between external remote services, which that is a bundle of any legitimate access to your remote environment, typically remote desktop protocol or VPNs, or phishing, which is the use of manipulative emails to manipulate, to con, to social engineer folks into either disclosing their credentials or into actually taking action to maliciously transfer funds or install software. You see in the first half of 2021, there's a migration, or really an introduction, of the exploit of public-facing applications. And this is explainable, unfortunately, with just a few large technologies. So there are certain technologies in your organization that must face the internet in order to work. One of those famously is Exchange, and I will talk about that in a moment, but that's your email. That's an email service, and you can be running that public-facing application in order to send and receive email. Unfortunately, this past year saw an enormous number of high-severity vulnerabilities in some of those very, very popular public-facing applications. And because, as Catherine mentioned, we have been moving towards distributed work and needing those public-facing applications more and more frequently, we see the exploits being developed and used and allowing the attackers to take advantage of those exploits to launch their monetization techniques. And as we see here on the next slide, the actual severity for those techniques, it's important to note as well. So it's not just the change in the complexion of what they're using, but rather the severity for each. And the main thing I want to highlight here is in both areas, you see the external remote service severity is very, very high. it should be perhaps it's not surprising that a service that's designed for remote access can provide remote access not just for legitimate users, but also for unauthorized users. So these are tough to secure, and they're tempting to use, especially in a COVID-motivated distributed work environment. And so you see both in 2020 and 2021, the fact that external remote services are available means that they are going to be exploited. And I want to spend just a moment to talk about what we mean by using these remote services. Sometimes it's an actual exploit of those remote services, but typically that would be categorized under exploit public-facing application. For example, if your VPN provider, your virtual private network appliance had a bug and that was exploited, that would be in that dark blue bar there. What we're talking about here is usually credentials are stolen or they're brute forced and they are used to employ legitimate access to those remote services. So if you can steal someone's credentials through a variety of means, for example, through phishing, you can then use remote services. You can also brute force those. As you see on the first half of 2021, multiple techniques are being used. And what we capture in our report is the primary vector, the primary technique used by the attacker, and then the severity of the claim that's associated with that. In the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the depth of this. When we have insecure remote access, how big is that problem? How often do we see businesses with insecure remote access enabled? You see here there is a significant spike between the 2020 report and the 2021 data. As noted here, the percentage of businesses that had insecure remote access enabled when they applied nearly doubled from 2020 to 2021. And there was a great question in the chat about why it is that we think that Coalition has lower claims rates. And it's through, this kind of ties into that. When you go through the application process at Coalition, there is a technical assessment that's part of that application process. And we're able to determine under certain circumstances whether there is remote access or insecure remote access enabled. And so we're seeing in those applications a skyrocketing number of cases where insecure remote access is enabled. What does insecure mean? Typically, it means it's without a multi-factor component. It can be a service like RDP that's directly exposed to the internet without some type of intervening proxy. There's a number of ways that we work with our insureds to secure remote access, and that's the biggest takeaway here, I think, from a go forward basis, is when we talk to our insureds who have had incidents that relate to insecure remote access, we have to come with solutions. It's not simply sufficient to say, we noticed this insecure remote access, good luck. It's a big differentiator for us to speak with them about what are ways in which you can obtain that remote access that you desperately need in a distributed work environment without exposing yourself to undue risk. So we're not lamenting the fact that remote access is necessary. We're just trying to motivate folks to do it in a secure way. Now let's talk a little bit about BECs. The actual techniques used here, very, very, very commonly done through phishing. This means tricking users into entering their credentials into an insecure site. And we see that that's about half of reported claims where that data is available. We do see an extraordinary difference between teams that use Microsoft 365 and Google Workplace or Google Workspace, pardon me. I will say there's a number of factors that contribute to that. Microsoft 365 is extraordinarily common in enterprise and small business. So part of this could be driven by simple availability. And then, of course, the email provider that you choose is not the only thing that affects risk. Having responded to many of these incidents myself, we also want to draw attention to a few defense in depth recommendations. First, defaults matter. Not all 365 instances are configured the same way. So certain security features and detections are available, but need to be enabled or turned on. And some are only available at the different price points within Microsoft 365. So we work with our insureds on a frequent basis, trying to enable the most secure defaults, the most secure settings in their 365 environment. Also, multi-factor authentication, it's really, you can't overstate this enough. And then likewise, multi-step verification for any transactions, that phone call to the bank that confirms that that transaction needs to be made. These are the things that we layer upon this. So not only are we trying to find out that initial vector of compromise, but what are the layers of defensive preventive techniques we can use to prevent it. I want to walk through real quick the typical process for a funds transfer fraud as well, which usually involves BEC, that kind of ties all this together. So the attacker has to identify victims and then typically sends phishing emails, like I said, to motivate users to enter credentials into a fake portal. So once they do that, malicious logins are performed sometimes within seconds. These are done with what's called an exploit kit or a phishing kit, and it has become very commoditized and very professionalized, unfortunately, on the attacker's behalf. And then once they are in the email environment, the hacker is looking for transactions to intercept. So we'll see forensic evidence of searches being performed, looking for different types of spreadsheets or data in the environment to understand what's the best opportunity for them to strike with respect to their manipulation. They'll create mailbox rules to avoid detection. So any emails that match certain characteristics will be forwarded to certain folders to hide them from the legitimate user. And then they'll work to modify those payment instructions, change that payment information, which, as Catherine said, is very rare in reality, but unfortunately, this does prove to be successful for the attackers occasionally. And then we do see attackers that will continue that social engineering through voice or video to actually verify those instructions. And then they'll receive that fraudulent funds transfer and use that compromised mailbox to launch follow-on attacks to other environments. It's very pernicious, it's repeated year over year, and it's one of those things where this type of broad awareness is a critical part of the future solution, because without advocacy to the stakeholders, to the people who are doing this on a day-to-day basis, there's really very little chance for us to move the needle with respect to frequency and severity. Related to funds transfer fraud, I did want to spend a moment to talk about Microsoft Exchange, which you may have heard from some of your customers. This is a transition from the concept of email-related attacks into this idea of supply chain compromise. So, email is provided by a variety of providers, of course, but the huge provider in the room is Microsoft, usually through Office 365, their cloud product, but we still have many hundreds of insureds that have Microsoft on-premise Exchange. And this year was a bad year for Microsoft Exchange in terms of vulnerabilities. There was a sequence of really the entire year, it's ongoing to this very day, of very severe public-facing vulnerabilities that allow compromise of the Microsoft Exchange environment. And that really bridges the gap between compromise of email data, which of course would be accessible, but also it provides a foothold into their environment, which can then lead to things like ransomware and data theft. The last kind of execution component of the past year that was particularly notable was the idea of injecting the attacker using the supply chain as part of their vector. And in the old days, we would talk about vendor risk, and we certainly still have this idea of vendor risk. But what we don't realize is that whenever your vendor becomes more technologically complex, they themselves have vendors, and they themselves are making technology choices that can introduce risk to your business and your clients' businesses. And so these vendors rely on vendors. There is a chain of providers, and this technical cyber supply chain introduces some risks that historically we've not seen as severely impacted as they were in 2020 and into 2021. And this supply chain risk management, SCRM, vendor risk management, or third-party risk management is something that we as incident responders are having to work with our insureds on a very frequent basis to really have them examine the technologies that their managed providers or their subscription providers are using to make sure that they are secure, because they are adopting that risk. Very briefly, and I know we're kind of getting close to some questions here, I want to talk a little bit about the cyber predictions that you'll see in the 2021 report as well. We and this is not just me and Catherine, but our entire group of folks, having looked at this data and looking at the forward-looking trends in threat intelligence, we predict an increase in ransomware, both in terms of frequency and severity, due largely to its highly monetized nature and because of the professionalization of the ecosystem. There is a hardening cyber insurance market, and we predict that that'll continue to harden throughout the rest of this year. The supply chain attacks I just mentioned, we believe that they will continue targeting that software and service providers because it's a high multiple. One attack can provide them insight and access to a huge variety of downstream customers. We predict increased regulation, and we're actually already seeing that. We have had our company leadership involved in national level discussions about the best way to solve these problems, which is an extraordinary privilege for the company. And we're trying to take some of these insights and some of this data to help all of our policymakers make the best decisions possible. Nation state actors have been extraordinarily involved in these past attacks, whether it's Exchange or other huge attacks like SolarWinds. And those nation state actors will continue to see, now that they've seen the impact, will continue to expand. But the main prediction here is that we will see predictable attacks and avoidable attacks still being successful. That is to say, most attacks can still be avoided in the future. And it's a broken record, but securing email through multi-factor authentication, patching software, staying on top of your supply chain relationships, and having defense in depth all the way down to your accounting processes is going to be the way that we change that prediction. So hopefully that one's a miss. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Marisa to talk about accessing the claims report itself, and then we'll talk about some questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much to Catherine and Chris for all of that incredibly useful and important information. We will be sending a recording of the webinar to your email after we have concluded this session. And if you have any questions or you want more details about the information from this webinar, you have access to the full claims report via the broker resource page from your coalition dashboard. We will also be sending in that email with the recording, and of course, encourage you to share with your network and your policyholders. We are going to open it up to some questions. I see that Catherine and Chris have been doing their due diligence in the chat and answering live, which is fantastic. We do still have a couple questions that came through that I will pass off, starting with Catherine. Curious what Coalition's sort of thought process is when it comes to paying or not paying a ransom.
Obviously, nobody likes paying a criminal, but in working with the insured, what we do is we look for things like backups, because it's actually quicker to rebuild from a backup. And we also look at the viability of the company and what should be done. But when it's needed, right? When we have a customer who is brought to their knees and cannot function, we absolutely do pay. This is something that is part of insurance, and you've heard now from the federal government that they are not going to ban the payment of ransom. And so we have that support as well. Additionally, we pay on behalf. This is a very important difference in the policy. Some policies out there require an insured to pay and then seek reimbursement. A lot of these smaller entities, even larger entities, they don't have millions of dollars sitting around to pay this ransom. So we instead pay on behalf. We step in their shoes and pay the money directly to the threat actor, not requiring an insured to go out and basically get a loan. Marisa, there was also a question about the materials sector, an increase in ransomware there. Materials sector is, anything with a material, right? Glass, paper, forest products, and believe it or not, hand sanitizer. And so, yes, we've absolutely seen an increase in that materials sector. We have seen these, and it's related packaging, all of those types of things. We've had ransomware cases that have brought manufacturing and this materials sectors to their knees, so they were not able to supply their materials to others to build in their production. So we've seen this from everything from alcohol that was to go in hand sanitizer. We've seen it to plastics that goes into lenses for contacts, and the list goes on.
Excellent. Chris, we did see a question when we looked at the tactics and techniques, the inclusion in 2021 of brute force attacks. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So brute force attacks really include anything where you're trying a variety of options. So if you're trying, the username Chris and then every possible password. Now, the most naive type of brute force is checking every possible password, which is very rare actually. So you don't try like A and then AB and then ABC. Instead, what attackers do is they operate with dictionaries of common passwords and then permutation rules of those common passwords so that they're hitting the most likely and most common passwords first. There's also this technique called password spraying, where they'll take very, very common passwords and use them across a variety of different usernames. So these are all sort of subtle variations on the idea that rather than breaking in per se, you sort of try every key combination, and that brute force bucket includes all those subtle variations. Real quick, we're using verbiage and nomenclature from what's called the MITRE ATT&CK framework, or the MITRE ATT&CK taxonomy. In the cybersecurity world, we're trying to align on ways to talk about how attackers behave so that we're not all making up different words for the same behavior. So these turns of phrase, even if they're somewhat confusing or a little awkward sometimes, the benefit is that we're using the same turns of phrase that all other InfoSec companies are aligning on. And while I have the floor, I had another great question here about the balancing the need for remote access and the use of the cloud. So, having the idea of local backups and controls that are not in the cloud. I will say this, for most of our small and mid-sized clients, moving away from on-prem file shares and email would have enormous benefits. There are certainly trade-offs, but we have seen one of the biggest challenges is when we have local file shares that have essentially like your classic map a drive style file shares, where if they're compromised, it has essentially the entire business's information. And so when Catherine talked about the attackers stealing the information to use as like a cudgel to motivate paying ransom, it's much harder for them to do that if all the data is not on one server that can be compromised by one privileged account. So we're very bullish on the moving of certain processes to the cloud if multi-factor authentication and other controls are in place, but then that has to be backed up with local alternatives for a disaster recovery type of scenario. But we are, very, very thoroughly in favor of migration to cloud for most basic file sharing use cases and things like that.
Fantastic. So it looks like we are about at time here. I know there's still some excellent questions here in the chat. We will work to get those addressed. We also have live chat on our website, so you can get a response within minutes. And please feel free to email us at help@coalitioninc.com. And you can also reply to the email you will receive after this webinar, and we will answer any questions you have. Big thanks to Catherine and Chris today. And we hope you all have a lovely rest of your day.